In a quiet hospital ward, where hope and fragility lived side by side, babies began to die. Behind the soft smile of a trusted nurse lurked a secret so dark, it would shatter Britain's faith in its most sacred institution. This is the untold story of Lucy Letby. It begins with silence. The kind of silence that feels wrong inside a place that should be filled with the small, rhythmic sounds of survival. The beeping of monitors, the faint hiss of oxygen, the shallow breaths of newborns clinging to life. A neonatal unit is meant to be fragile but safe, a sanctuary of medicine and vigilance where miracles happen quietly every day. But between 2015 and 2016, inside the Countess of Chester Hospital in northwest England, that silence began to take on another meaning. Too often, it was the silence that follows an alarm, the hush that falls when doctors and nurses have lost their battle to save a baby. At first, no one suspected the pattern. Premature babies are vulnerable, and not all of them survive. The staff were accustomed to tragedy. But gradually, unease crept into the ward. The deaths were becoming too frequent, too clustered, too inexplicable. Behind the glass walls of the incubators, babies were collapsing without warning. Parents who had been told their child was stable were suddenly being called back in, rushing through corridors only to find frantic resuscitations underway. Doctors recorded unexplained changes in oxygen levels, heart rates plunging, bleeding that had no clear medical cause. And through it all, one nurse seemed always to be there. Her name was Lucy Letby. By outward appearances, she was the last person anyone would imagine in such a story. Quiet, polite, almost painfully ordinary, Lucy had been the kind of girl neighbors described as sweet and helpful. She came from Hereford, a cathedral city where life moved at a slower pace, raised by doting parents who saw their only child as their pride and joy. Friends remembered her as shy, bookish, a little awkward but kind-hearted. Her teachers described her as diligent. She wasn't rebellious, didn't fall into the traps that ensnared many teenagers. She wanted to be a nurse from a young age, inspired partly because she herself had needed special care as a newborn. To those who knew her, the dream seemed noble, almost inevitable. Lucy, the girl who loved babies, would dedicate her life to saving them. She pursued that dream methodically, studying child nursing at the University of Chester, securing a placement at the Countess of Chester Hospital, and eventually landing a permanent role in the neonatal unit. She was the first in her family to attend university. Her parents beamed with pride at her graduation, posting photos in the local newspaper. For years, there was nothing remarkable about her career. Colleagues found her bland, reserved, someone who blended into the background. She wasn't a standout star of the ward, nor was she a problem. She was simply there, doing her shifts, writing her notes, learning from senior staff. But in June 2015, a line was crossed. That month marked the beginning of what prosecutors later described as a series of deliberate attacks on the most vulnerable patients in the hospital. Over the course of just 12 months, at least 13 babies collapsed under suspicious circumstances, and many died. The pattern, when finally pieced together, was chilling. The first incident was written off as a tragedy. A baby who had been premature and fragile suddenly deteriorated and could not be saved. Families grieved, staff comforted one another, and the ward carried on. But then it happened again, and again. Each time, Lucy Letby's name appeared on the duty roster. Each time she was present, sometimes alone, sometimes in the company of others. Colleagues began to notice the coincidence, though at first, it seemed unthinkable that one of their own could be responsible. Doctors whispered among themselves. Some started keeping private notes. They observed strange anomalies. Air bubbles in circulation, unexpected bleeding, milk feed volumes given in unusual amounts. Babies found gravely ill shortly after Letby had been at their bedside. Still, suspicion remained an unspeakable thing. How could a nurse, a caregiver, possibly be the source of harm? For the parents, nothing about Lucy suggested danger. She was attentive, often offering to take photos of families cradling their premature babies, moments they treasured. She wrote notes of sympathy to grieving parents. She bought gifts. To them, she was kind, professional, someone they trusted in the most vulnerable moment of their lives. But behind the trust, a storm was brewing. Within the hospital, consultants began raising alarms. Dr. Stephen Breyer, one of the senior doctors, was among the first to openly voice concern that the pattern of collapses was not natural. He and other consultants went to hospital management repeatedly, demanding that Letby be removed from the ward. But hospital administrators resisted, insisting there was no proof, no clear evidence. Removing a nurse based on suspicion alone, they argued, was unfair and reputationally risky for the hospital. For months, the warnings were ignored. Babies continued to die. By 2016, the situation could no longer be brushed aside. An internal review flagged the abnormal number of deaths. Police were quietly consulted, and in July 2018, Lucy Letby was arrested at her home. The image of her being led away in handcuffs, expressionless, wearing a faded hoodie, shocked the nation. The charges that followed would make her Britain's most notorious modern female serial killer. But even as she stood trial, she remained an enigma. There was no obvious motive, no psychological profile neatly explaining her actions. She denied everything, insisting she had never harmed a child. Yet police had discovered handwritten notes in her home, scribbled confessions and self-accusations. "I am evil, I did this. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough." Were these the tortured ramblings of guilt, or the desperate self-blame of someone wrongfully accused? This question still divides public opinion. Some see her as a monster who exploited her position of trust to commit acts of unthinkable cruelty. Others argue she is a scapegoat, a victim of systemic hospital failings and a rush to judgment. The truth lies buried in medical data, in testimony, in the lived agony of parents who lost their babies. To understand Lucy Letby's story is to peel back layers of contradictions. The caring nurse who may have been a killer, the ordinary upbringing that led to extraordinary horror, the professional environment where warnings went unheeded. It is a story about medicine, justice, institutional failure, and the darkest corners of human behavior. And it begins, not with the courtroom drama or the police investigation, but with a simple question. How does someone so ordinary become the center of one of the most chilling murder cases in British history? The Countess of Chester Hospital was never meant to be a place of national attention. It was a mid-sized district hospital, serving its community with quiet efficiency. Mothers gave birth there, broken bones were set there, lives were saved and lost there in the ordinary rhythm of British healthcare. The neonatal unit was small, 4 rooms in total, built not for the sickest of babies but for those who needed extra care, a stepping stone between fragility and survival. Inside those rooms, the atmosphere was usually calm but purposeful. Monitors hummed with steady electronic beeps. Nurses in blue scrubs moved between incubators, checking lines and tubes, adjusting oxygen settings, soothing tiny fists that fought against the walls of their plastic worlds. Parents sat nearby, cradling their hope as tenderly as they cradled their children. For many, this was the place where their baby's life began. But for more than a dozen families, it became the place where that life abruptly ended. Doctors who worked there would later describe their unease in hesitant, measured words. "It just didn't feel right," one said. "We were losing babies we shouldn't have lost." The collapses didn't match the typical patterns of neonatal decline. Some infants, though vulnerable, had been stable one moment and critically ill the next. Resuscitations were often frantic, chaotic, with baffling symptoms that defied explanation. At first, it was chalked up to the unpredictability of neonatology. Any consultant will tell you, in a ward like this, tragedy sometimes arrives without warning. But in 2015, the tragedies were arriving too close together, and always Lucy Letby was there. She wasn't the kind of nurse who drew suspicion easily. Bland, polite, diligent. Her demeanor was as unthreatening as a blank sheet of paper. She bought coffee for colleagues, celebrated birthdays, posted cheerful selfies with friends. Parents remembered her offering to take photographs of them holding their babies, a kindness they clung to when those photos became their last memories. In the aftermath of deaths, she sometimes wrote sympathy cards. On the surface, she seemed compassionate. But beneath that surface, detectives would later argue, she was cultivating another role. One of control, of being at the center when life teetered on the edge of death. The first baby to die under suspicious circumstances did so in June 2015. Staff mourned, parents were shattered, but no one thought of foul play. Only in hindsight would this case be marked as the start of a horrifying sequence. Within weeks, another infant collapsed. And another. By the end of the summer, whispers had started among the consultants. Was something happening on their ward that couldn't be explained by medicine alone? Dr. Stephen Breyer, the lead consultant, took notice. He had seen neonatal deaths before, of course, every doctor in his field had, but what disturbed him was the clustering. The collapses weren't random. They seemed to happen when one particular nurse was on duty. Breyer raised the issue with hospital management. He was told not to jump to conclusions. Staff shortages were pressing. The suggestion that one of their own could be harming babies was unthinkable, almost insulting to the institution. So the pattern continued. For families, the tragedies came one by one, each cloaked in bewilderment. Parents who had decorated nurseries and chosen names were suddenly arranging funerals. They were reassured that their babies had been fragile, that these things sometimes happen. They grieved quietly, never suspecting that the person who had stood at their child's incubator might have been the cause. The truth, if we accept the jury's verdict, was more sinister. Methods varied. Some infants were injected with air. Others were overfed with milk. Some suffered sudden, unexplained bleeding. Each technique was subtle enough to mimic a natural medical collapse, but lethal enough to push fragile bodies beyond recovery. Detectives later argued that Letby wasn't careless. She was deliberate. She knew precisely how to inflict damage that could be explained away, at least for a while. That was the chilling paradox of the case. She appeared both ordinary and meticulous, outwardly dedicated to saving lives while secretly orchestrating deaths. By 2016, the consultants' concerns had reached a breaking point. They demanded Letby be removed from the ward. Hospital managers hesitated, insisting there was no definitive proof. To remove her would mean scandal, questions, the suggestion that their neonatal unit had harbored danger. Instead, they allowed her to remain. It was a catastrophic decision. When police were finally brought in, the scale of suspicion became clear. Between June 2015 and June 2016, at least 17 babies had died or collapsed under circumstances prosecutors later described as highly suspicious. A pattern emerged. The one common factor across the cases was Lucy Letby's presence. And so, in July 2018, police arrived at her Chester home. The footage of her arrest has become infamous. The door opens. A young woman, hair tied back, wearing a faded hoodie with pastel lettering, stares blankly as officers step inside. She doesn't resist. She doesn't protest. Within minutes, she is in handcuffs, led to a waiting car. Neighbors watch in disbelief. To them, she had been the quiet nurse who waved politely, who kept to herself. To the nation, she would soon become a headline, the nurse accused of killing babies. Her parents, John and Sue, were devastated. They had always doted on their only child. Lucy had been the focus of their lives, the reason for their pride, their stability. Now, cameras were outside their Hereford home, reporters knocking on doors, neighbors whispering. Their daughter was being accused of the unthinkable. As the investigation widened, more disturbing discoveries surfaced. In Letby's house, police found notes, scribbled, chaotic confessions. "I am evil, I did this. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough." Was this evidence of guilt, or the self-punishing scrawl of a woman breaking under accusation? The prosecution presented them as damning. The defense argued they were the writings of despair, not admission. By the time her trial began in 2022, the case had become one of the most notorious in British history. For 10 months, the nation watched as evidence was laid out. Charts of deaths, testimony of doctors, the haunting words of grieving parents. Lucy Letby, sitting in the dock, showed little emotion. She denied everything. She insisted she had cared only for her patients, that she had been a scapegoat for systemic hospital failings. But the jury was not convinced. In August 2023, she was convicted of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 more. She was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of release. She will die behind bars. And yet, the questions didn't end with the verdict. How could someone like Lucy Letby, ordinary, unremarkable, with no history of violence, become Britain's most prolific child serial killer? What drove her? Was it a hunger for control, a psychological fracture, something darker still? Or was she, as her few remaining supporters argue, the victim of a catastrophic miscarriage of justice? The answers remain elusive. But to understand this case, we have to start at the beginning, with Lucy's childhood, her upbringing, her path into nursing, and the first cracks in the facade that presented her as ordinary. Because in the story of Lucy Letby, the horror lies not only in the crimes themselves, but in the contrast between who she seemed to be and what she is accused of becoming. And so our journey begins. Lucy Letby was born on January 4, 1990, in Hereford, a small cathedral city nestled near the Welsh border. To outsiders, Hereford looked like the archetype of English ordinariness. Tudor timber-framed houses leaning over narrow streets, a quiet market square, and the looming presence of the medieval cathedral. It was the sort of place where everyone seemed to know everyone else, and where neighbors could recall seeing each other's children grow from toddlers to teenagers. Lucy was the only child of John and Sue Letby, and from the very beginning she occupied the center of their world. John was older, a traditional man who had spent his career managing a family-run furniture shop. Sue, younger by more than a decade, worked as an accounts clerk. Together they provided Lucy with stability, devotion, and, some would later argue, a degree of protectiveness that bordered on smothering. Neighbors remembered the family as quiet but close. Sue was seen walking Lucy to school with the family's beloved Yorkshire Terrier, Whiskey, trotting along beside them. Friends who visited the Letby household described walls dotted with framed photos of Lucy, evidence of her parents' pride in every milestone. She was the sort of child who drew little criticism. Well-behaved, diligent, respectful. Teachers noticed her conscientiousness. She wasn't rebellious, didn't push boundaries. But she wasn't popular either. At school, Lucy fell into the geeky group, a circle of studious girls who preferred homework to parties. She wasn't invisible. Those who knew her remembered her kindness and flashes of dry humor, but she wasn't someone who drew attention. Classmates recalled her as polite, friendly in small circles, but awkward and reserved in larger groups. Even as a teenager, she seemed sheltered, untouched by the wilder aspects of adolescence. Her closest friend was Dawn, a girl she met at secondary school. Together with a small band of friends, they formed a tight-knit group of in-betweeners. They weren't the cool kids, but they weren't outcasts either. They spent afternoons in the library, lunchtimes in the geography block, evenings at sleepovers drinking lemonade and watching The X Factor. For Lucy, that was enough. One thing set her apart, though, her certainty about the future. While many teenagers waver between dreams of law, teaching, or travel, Lucy seemed to have known her path from the start. She wanted to be a nurse, specifically a neonatal nurse. She told Dawn it was because of her own difficult birth, that she owed her life to the nurses who had cared for her as a newborn. That sense of destiny carried her through her school years. She chose her subjects deliberately, geared every effort toward her goal. Her schoolwork reflected the same precision. She was meticulous with her notes, rarely careless, rarely making mistakes. A geography teacher became one of her favorites, praising her attention to detail. Classmates remembered her willingness to write 2 sets of notes, one for herself and one for a friend who had fallen behind. Outside school, she seemed sheltered but content. She adored her dog, Whiskey, scribbling his name on scraps of paper years later when her world began to unravel. She had little interest in teenage romances, and some friends sensed she disapproved when others began dating. It wasn't jealousy exactly, more a sense that Lucy was somehow behind, still holding on to childhood when others were rushing into adolescence. Despite that, she had aspirations of a future family of her own. She and her friends talked about wedding dresses and children, the ordinary daydreams of teenage girls. But in practice, Lucy remained apart. She never seemed to have boyfriends, never brought home romantic partners, and always appeared more comfortable within the safety of her family or small circle of female friends. In August 2008, she received her A-level results. She had worked hard, harder than most, to secure the grades she needed for university. When the envelope opened and her future was sealed, her parents were elated. Lucy had been accepted at the University of Chester to study child nursing. She was the first in her family to attend university. For John and Sue, it was a triumph, proof that their devotion had paid off. Chester, just over 100 miles from Hereford, wasn't a drastic leap into the unknown, but it was far enough that Lucy would taste independence for the first time. For the girl who had lived under the protective shadow of her parents, this was both exhilarating and intimidating. University life brought new friendships and new routines, but Lucy remained much the same. Diligent, responsible, part of a small group of geeky girls. She attended nights out, but she was never one of the rowdy ones. She was usually the first to leave, always making sure she was prepared for lectures the next morning. One classmate recalled that she came in, did her work, and went home. She wasn't exceptional academically. Nursing didn't come effortlessly. Her results were solid but not outstanding. She was competent but not brilliant. Still, she worked steadily, and that diligence was enough. By her early 20s, Lucy had begun placements in the very place that would later define her, the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit. It was a small unit, intimate enough that everyone knew each other, professional enough to give Lucy the experience she needed. She was paired with a mentor, an experienced nurse who guided her through the routines of neonatal care. Those who worked alongside her saw nothing alarming. She was quiet, a little shy, sometimes described as bland, but competent. When she graduated in 2011, she did so with relief and pride. A notice in her hometown paper featured her graduation photo and a message from her parents. "We are so proud of you after all your hard work. Love, Mom and Dad." She accepted a permanent role in the neonatal unit she already knew. It seemed like the perfect fit, close to her adopted home in Chester, surrounded by colleagues she trusted, working in the field she had always dreamed of. In photos from that period, Lucy appears cheerful, smiling with colleagues on nights out, posing with friends in fancy dress. She looked happy, settled. She was building a life. She had friends, a career, and a family that adored her. On paper, Lucy Letby was the picture of ordinary success. A diligent student, a caring nurse, a beloved daughter. Nothing about her suggested danger. Nothing pointed toward the storm that was about to break. But beneath the ordinariness, cracks were forming. Cracks no one would see until it was far too late. By 2014, Lucy Letby's life appeared settled into a predictable rhythm. She was living in Chester, working shifts at the Countess of Chester Hospital's neonatal unit, socializing occasionally with colleagues. Nights out were modest dinners, hendos, Christmas parties. She was still single, and while friends paired off, married, and started families, Lucy seemed content to orbit quietly around her work and her parents. She visited them often in Hereford, texted them daily, and went on annual family holidays to Torquay. To many, the closeness looked enviable. To some, it looked suffocating. In messages later uncovered, Lucy hinted at tension. Her parents, she said, worried constantly. They disliked that she had moved away, hoped she would return. They fussed over her, and Lucy, though devoted to them, sometimes felt weighed down by the intensity of their love. She was, after all, their only child, the focus of every hope and fear. Still, her life ticked along. In 2014, she moved briefly into her own rented house. But by mid-2015, she returned to the hospital's accommodation. It was easier, closer, more convenient. She decorated her room with fairy lights, cards, little reminders of friendship. On social media, she projected a cheerful, wholesome image. Friends described her as geeky, but kind, someone who worked hard, played safe, and never caused trouble. Inside the neonatal unit, her colleagues described her as competent, though not remarkable. Bland, one doctor said. Another noted she was a little odd, quiet, timid, hard to read. But no one voiced suspicion. She was trusted to care for the hospital's most fragile patients, premature and sick newborns. The Countess of Chester neonatal unit was not large. For rooms, a handful of incubators, humming machines that filled the air with a steady chorus of beeps. The unit was classed as Level 2, not designed for the most critical cases but equipped to stabilize and nurture premature babies until they were strong enough to go home. Every neonatal unit sees tragedy. Babies born too soon, too small, sometimes don't survive. Staff were used to grief, though each loss carried its weight. But overall, the Countess of Chester unit was considered safe. Deaths were rare, and most babies eventually thrived. That would change in June 2015. First, it looked like an ordinary tragedy. A baby who had been premature and fragile suddenly deteriorated. Resuscitation failed. Staff mourned, parents wept, and life on the unit carried on. There was nothing immediately suspicious. Death was part of the landscape of neonatology. But within weeks, another infant collapsed. And another. Babies who had been stable suddenly turned blue, stopped breathing, bled internally, or showed bizarre swings in oxygen levels. Each case was different, but the pattern was unmistakable. Too many collapses, too close together, with no clear medical explanation. Behind closed doors, consultants began whispering. They compared notes, studied charts. They saw air bubbles in circulation, unusual feed volumes, notes that didn't add up. And they saw one common factor. Lucy Letby was present at every incident. At first, no one wanted to believe it. Nurses are the lifeblood of neonatal care. Trusted, compassionate, devoted. The suggestion that one of them could be harming babies was unthinkable. But the coincidences mounted. Something isn't right. One doctor told a colleague, "This shouldn't be happening." For parents, the nightmare unfolded one child at a time. Mothers and fathers who had decorated nurseries and dared to hope suddenly found themselves planning funerals. They were told their babies had been fragile, that such things happen. They didn't question the explanations. How could they? Their children had been in the care of professionals. But among the professionals themselves, suspicion was beginning to grow. The summer of 2015 marked the beginning of a year of devastation. A year when tragedy would strike the neonatal unit again and again. By its end, more than a dozen families would be shattered. Consultants would be at war with hospital management, and police would be preparing for an investigation unlike any other. And at the center of it all was Lucy Letby, the quiet, ordinary nurse no one had ever suspected. Hospitals are built on routine. Every day in a neonatal unit begins with the same quiet choreography. The monitors ticking, nurses checking charts, doctors making rounds, parents gripping coffee cups in plastic chairs by incubators. Even the crises, when they come, follow familiar patterns. A baby dips in oxygen saturation, alarms sound, staff respond with well-practiced speed. Most of the time, babies stabilize. Sometimes they don't. But in the summer of 2015, the routines at the Countess of Chester began to fracture. It started with a single baby boy in June. He had been premature, vulnerable, but stable. His parents were cautiously hopeful. Nurses described him as doing remarkably well for his gestation. And then, without warning, he deteriorated catastrophically. Resuscitation efforts failed. His death, though tragic, was recorded as one of those cruel turns of fate that sometimes happen in neonatal care. Staff comforted one another. They comforted the family. Then they carried on. Days later, another baby collapsed. And another. By July, 3 infants had died on the same unit in quick succession. For doctors who had worked in neonatology for years, it was deeply unusual. The deaths weren't spread out over months or years, but clustered tightly together. Each child had been considered stable before suddenly collapsing. The events didn't fit the usual rhythm of neonatal medicine. And there was something else. In each case, one nurse had been present. Lucy Letby. She wasn't the only nurse on duty during those shifts. The unit was staffed by a team, and collapses sometimes occurred in the presence of others. But as consultants pieced together the incidents, her name appeared again and again on the rosters. At first, it seemed like an unlucky coincidence. After all, she worked many shifts. But as the deaths mounted, coincidence began to look less likely. For the parents, the tragedies were unbearable. They had been told their babies were stable. They had begun to imagine bringing them home. Instead, they were called into emergency rooms, forced to watch as doctors and nurses fought to save their newborns, and then told it was over. They left the hospital with empty arms, some clutching only sympathy cards or tiny locks of hair in memory boxes. One mother later described the pain as like watching your heart stop outside your body. Another said she could still hear the beeping of the machines in her sleep years later. But at the time, none of them suspected that the nurse who had smiled at them, who had taken photographs of them holding their child, might have been connected to the loss. Among the doctors, suspicion grew in whispers. Dr. Stephen Breyer, the lead consultant, began to keep mental notes. He wasn't ready to accuse anyone. Such an idea was almost unthinkable, but he couldn't ignore the pattern. Other consultants noticed too. They saw anomalies. Unusual air in circulation, sudden bleeding in babies who had shown no signs of clotting disorders, gastric distension far beyond what should have been possible. By late summer, the atmosphere on the unit was shifting. The nurses carried on as usual, caring for their tiny patients. But among the consultants, a quiet dread took hold. Something was happening that none of them could explain. The deaths were rare enough that each one reverberated through the unit. Staff went home shaken. Some couldn't sleep. Some began to dread walking through the hospital doors, fearing what they might face next. And yet, in official terms, nothing had changed. Hospital managers assured the team that mortality rates fluctuate. They pointed out that the Countess of Chester was a small unit. Statistical clusters, they said, could happen by chance. They resisted any suggestion of malpractice. To question a nurse was to risk scandal. But the deaths didn't stop. In September, another baby collapsed. In October, yet another. Each case was different, but the similarities gnawed at the doctors. Babies who should have recovered didn't. Babies who had been improving suddenly plunged into crisis. And once again, Lucy Letby's name was there on the rota. She didn't draw suspicion from parents. To them, she remained kind, attentive, sometimes even comforting. She offered to take family photos, arranged mementos, wrote sympathy cards in neat handwriting. After one baby's death, she attended the funeral, standing quietly among mourners. For those grieving families, her presence seemed that of a caring nurse. For detectives years later, it looked chillingly like a killer inserting herself into the aftermath. By the winter of 2015, the pattern had become undeniable to the doctors. They began to discuss it openly among themselves. They debated possibilities. Was it an infection spreading undetected? A flaw in the equipment? Something in the environment? They checked blood cultures, tested machinery, reviewed procedures. Nothing explained the anomalies. In early 2016, another wave of collapses struck. By now, the consultants were keeping detailed records. They logged who was on shift, what treatments had been given, what symptoms appeared. The notes pointed again to one constant presence. Lucy Letby. Dr. Breyer and his colleagues took their concerns to hospital management formally. They urged that she be removed from the ward, at least temporarily, while an investigation was carried out. But managers resisted. They argued there was no concrete evidence against her, no proof of wrongdoing. Removing her, they said, could expose the hospital to legal risk, could damage morale. It could ruin the reputation of an innocent nurse. So Lucy remained, and the deaths continued. For the doctors, it was a nightmare of helplessness. They were trained to save lives, to solve problems, to act decisively. But here they were, watching baby after baby collapse under circumstances they could not explain, sounding alarms that went unheard by those in charge. For the parents, it was grief upon grief. Families who had never met one another became bound by tragedy, linked by a hospital that had promised life but delivered loss. And for Lucy Letby, life outwardly carried on. She went to salsa classes with friends. She texted colleagues about work gossip. She posted cheerful photos online. To the outside world, she was just another young nurse living her life. Inside the neonatal unit, though suspicion was tightening around her like a noose. The consultants didn't yet know how to prove it. They didn't yet have the authority to act. But they were certain of one thing. Something or someone was killing their babies. The year-long storm had only just begun. By the start of 2016, the unease inside the Countess of Chester neonatal unit had hardened into something darker. It was no longer just an impression, no longer just bad luck. It was a conviction among several senior doctors. Something unnatural was happening on their ward. January brought more collapses. A baby girl who had been improving suddenly deteriorated, her oxygen levels plummeting in a way that baffled doctors. She was resuscitated, stabilized, and then collapsed again within hours. The cycle repeated, as if some invisible hand was pushing her back toward death each time she clawed her way to life. Staff were shaken, parents were distraught, and when the notes were checked, Lucy Letby had been on duty throughout. In February, another baby, a twin, collapsed shortly after his sibling had suffered an unexplained event days earlier. Both infants had been considered stable. Now both had nearly died, one fatally. Again, Lucy was present. The consultants couldn't ignore it anymore. They began to document everything. Every unexplained collapse, every shift Letby worked, every symptom that defied explanation. Their private notes told a story that hospital managers didn't want to hear. For the consultants, the evidence was mounting like a storm surge. They saw patterns no one could dismiss. Babies collapsing when Letby was alone with them. Unusual symptoms, sudden air embolisms, inexplicable internal bleeding, inaccuracies and oddities in her medical notes, as though things had been recorded hastily or strategically. Yet when they approached management, they met resistance. Meetings were held in quiet hospital offices, where suits and administrators listened politely and then pushed back. "There's no proof," they said. "This could damage a nurse's career. We must consider the hospital's reputation." For the doctors, the words were infuriating. Reputation, careers, they were losing babies. Families were being shattered. And yet, instead of swift action, they were told to tread carefully, to avoid rash conclusions. By spring 2016, the death toll had grown. More families left the hospital in grief, their arms empty. Some were even comforted by Lucy herself, unaware of the suspicions swirling around her. She was there at funerals, signing sympathy cards, texting colleagues with condolences. To grieving parents, she appeared compassionate. To detectives years later, it looked chilling, a predator moving seamlessly from crime to consolation. The consultants, however, were running out of patience. They demanded formally that Letby be removed from clinical duties. At first, hospital management resisted. They argued again. What if she was innocent? What if the deaths were coincidental? The risk of litigation, they insisted, was too high. But the doctors pressed harder. In June 2016, after yet another unexplained collapse, their voices could no longer be ignored. Letby was finally taken off the neonatal ward. Not dismissed, not suspended, just reassigned to clerical duties. She was told she would be working in an administrative role while the hospital reviewed the situation. For the parents still coming to the unit, nothing was explained. They weren't told that a nurse had been quietly moved out of the ward under suspicion. They were given no reason for the change. The hospital's priority was to protect itself from scandal. Behind the scenes, though, something had shifted. The doctors had drawn a line. They had forced their managers to act, however reluctantly. For the first time, the deaths on the unit stopped. It was the silence that confirmed the doctors' worst fears. Babies were no longer collapsing inexplicably. The storm that had raged for 12 months seemed to vanish overnight. For Dr. Stephen Breyer and his colleagues, the implication was undeniable. Their suspicions had been right. A killer had been among them, and she was now gone from the ward. But the hospital still resisted calling in the police. Instead, they launched internal reviews, hired outside consultants, produced reports. Each report grew heavier with statistics, charts, cautious language. Still, they stopped short of pointing directly at Letby. It would take another year before the matter reached law enforcement. Another year before detectives were called in. Another year before the full scale of suspicion against Lucy Letby began to unfold. For now, in 2016, she was out of the unit but not out of nursing. She carried on quietly, outwardly unscathed, living in hospital accommodation, texting friends, visiting her parents, going to salsa classes. She had no idea that consultants were quietly compiling dossiers that would one day help put her behind bars. And the parents? They were left with only grief and unanswered questions. None of them knew, in those early days, that the person they had trusted most with their fragile babies was already under suspicion. The neonatal unit returned to its rhythms. The alarms quieted. The collapses stopped. Life, in some ways, went back to normal. But for the consultants, normal no longer existed. They had stared into the unthinkable. That one of their own had turned healer into executioner. And though Lucy Letby was no longer among the incubators, the shadow of her presence lingered. By the summer of 2016, the atmosphere inside the Countess of Chester neonatal unit had changed. The alarms were quieter, the resuscitation calls fewer. Babies who might have been at risk before were surviving again. For the consultants who had fought to have Lucy Letby removed, the silence was confirmation. It wasn't science, it wasn't coincidence, it was proof. Something had been happening on their ward, and now that she was gone, it had stopped. But hospital management did not want that conclusion written down. Instead, they pressed for reports couched in neutral language. They ordered statistical reviews, called in external experts, and produced documents filled with charts and cautious phrases. Words like cluster and anomaly softened the horror. There was no direct accusation, no explicit mention of a killer in their midst. For the grieving parents, none of this was explained. They were told little beyond what their own cases had already revealed. Their babies had died under tragic circumstances. Few, if any, suspected that whispers about a nurse were already circling behind closed doors. The consultants, though, were at breaking point. They had carried their suspicions for months, endured pushback from managers, watched helplessly as babies collapsed. They had seen enough. Quietly, they began pushing for the police to be called. It wasn't easy. To accuse a nurse of deliberately killing babies was to accuse an entire institution of failure. It meant admitting that warnings had been ignored, that a killer had been allowed to remain on duty for a year. The reputational damage could be catastrophic. Hospital administrators knew it. They hesitated. They delayed. They tried to manage the problem internally. But the consultants would not let it drop. In February 2017, after months of pressure, the hospital finally referred the matter to the police. The investigation was given a code name, Operation Hummingbird. Detectives from Cheshire Constabulary knew immediately they were dealing with something extraordinary. Suspected multiple infant murders inside a hospital, it was unprecedented. At first, the police approached cautiously. They began by reviewing the deaths of 15 babies and the non-fatal collapses of several more, all between March 2015 and July 2016. The scale of the task was daunting. Every chart, every medical note, every staff rota had to be examined. Thousands of pages of evidence were gathered. Detectives consulted medical experts, looking for patterns invisible to the untrained eye. Slowly, painstakingly, a picture began to emerge. Again and again, one name appeared. Lucy Letby. She was on shift during every suspicious death, present at nearly every collapse. Medical experts noted unusual features in the cases. Unexpected air embolisms, inexplicable bleeding, feedings given in volumes that could overwhelm fragile babies. Individually, each case might have been explained away. Together, they formed a chilling pattern. By July 2018, more than a year after the police began their inquiry, detectives decided they had enough to act. At 6 a.m. on July 3rd, they arrived at Lucy Letby's semi-detached house in Chester. The arrest was captured on police body cameras. The footage shows her opening the door, dressed casually in a hoodie with pastel lettering. She looks startled, but not hysterical. There is no struggle, no shouting. Officers explain she is under arrest on suspicion of murdering 8 babies and attempting to murder 6 others. Handcuffs are placed on her wrists. She is led out to a waiting police car, her face set in a blank expression. Neighbors watched in disbelief. Reporters scrambled for scraps of information. Within hours, her name was everywhere. The quiet young nurse from Hereford was now the central figure in one of the most shocking investigations in British history. Inside her home, police carried out a meticulous search. They bagged evidence, lifted floorboards, even examined drains and guttering. They found diaries, documents, and most disturbingly, handwritten notes that seemed to straddle confession and despair. One read, "I am evil, I did this." Another, "I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough." For detectives, the notes were devastating. For the prosecution, they would become a cornerstone of the case. The defense would later argue that they reflected depression and self-blame, not guilt. But to the public, the words seemed chillingly unambiguous. Lucy was questioned extensively. She denied everything. She insisted she had never harmed a child, that she had dedicated her life to caring for them. She was released on bail, pending further investigation. But Operation Hummingbird was only just beginning. Over the next 2 years, detectives expanded their inquiry. They examined more cases, consulted more experts, and slowly built a file so vast it would one day fill courtrooms for 10 months straight. The evidence was largely circumstantial. No CCTV, no forensic smoking gun. But the pattern was undeniable, and the notes found in her home cast a shadow that no defense could easily erase. In November 2020, Lucy Letby was charged with the murders of 7 babies and the attempted murders of 10 more. The stage was set for one of the longest and most harrowing trials in modern British history. But behind the headlines, questions lingered. Why had it taken so long for the police to be called? Why had hospital managers resisted the consultant's warnings? How many deaths might have been prevented if action had been taken sooner? For the parents, the knowledge was unbearable. Not only had they lost their children, but they learned that suspicions had existed long before the police were involved. That their babies might have been saved had someone acted earlier. Operation Hummingbird had begun with the promise of justice, but it had also unearthed something darker. A system that had failed the most vulnerable, and families who would carry that knowledge for the rest of their lives. And at the center of it all, Lucy Letby, the young nurse who, in the space of a year, had gone from invisible caregiver to Britain's most notorious female killer. The first arrest in July 2018 had shocked Britain. A young nurse, once anonymous among the thousands working quietly in the NHS, was suddenly accused of the most heinous crimes imaginable. But the arrest was only the beginning. After questioning, Lucy Letby was released on bail. She walked out of custody not as a free woman, but as someone shadowed by suspicion. The police continued their investigation, gathering evidence, combing through medical records, consulting more experts. For Letby, it meant months of waiting, months of uncertainty, months in which she was no longer a nurse but not yet a defendant in a courtroom. At home in Chester, her life became a strange limbo. She had been suspended from work. The friends who once surrounded her dwindled. Her closest ally remained her childhood friend Dawn, who believed in her innocence and corresponded with her regularly. But others pulled away. The accusations were too dark, too incomprehensible. Her parents, John and Sue, stood by her. They had been at her side since the beginning, attending every hearing, supporting her unconditionally. To them, Lucy was still their little girl, quiet, kind, incapable of the monstrous acts being suggested. Their loyalty would never waver, but their world had collapsed around them. Their Hereford home became a target for media attention. Neighbors watched, whispers spreading in the streets where Lucy had once been a child. The police, meanwhile, pressed on. They weren't finished with her. In June 2019, less than a year after the first arrest, detectives returned to her home. This time she was accused not just of 8 murders, but of multiple attempted murders as well. Again she was taken into custody, again she denied everything, and again she was released pending further inquiries. Another year passed. The case grew heavier with evidence. Charts, text messages, witness statements, medical records, handwritten notes. Detectives spoke to colleagues who described her as quiet, a little odd, sometimes timid. They interviewed parents, who recalled her being compassionate, even comforting, in their darkest hours. They compiled statistics showing the clustering of deaths when she was on duty. By November 2020, the Crown Prosecution Service concluded they had enough. Lucy Letby was charged formally with 7 counts of murder and 10 counts of attempted murder. She was remanded in custody. The ordinary nurse who had once blended invisibly into the background of hospital life was now facing the gravest charges a court could hear. The media seized on the story. Headlines branded her the killer nurse. Television segments replayed footage of her arrest. Reporters standing outside her former home. Cameras capturing every glimpse of her as she was led into court. But beneath the noise, the prosecution faced a challenge unlike most others. This was a case with no forensic smoking gun. There was no CCTV, no fingerprints, no DNA linking her to the collapses. Instead, the case rested on patterns, expert testimony, and the damning words found in her own handwriting. For prosecutors, building that case meant years of preparation. Every incident had to be presented in painstaking detail. Every baby's collapse explained to a jury with charts, graphs, and medical language made comprehensible. Every line of Letby's notes had to be examined. Was "I am evil, I did this" a confession or a cry of despair? For the defense, the challenge was equally monumental. They argued she was a scapegoat, a nurse blamed for failures within a struggling hospital. They pointed to the lack of forensic evidence. They suggested the consultants had been desperate for answers and had unfairly latched onto her. And so, for nearly 2 years after her formal charging, the case was prepared in silence. Behind courtroom doors, documents were assembled. Expert witnesses were briefed. Lawyers sharpened their strategies. Meanwhile, Lucy remained in custody. Her world had shrunk to a prison cell, letters from her parents, and occasional legal visits. She kept herself busy with writing, filling diaries and scraps of paper with thoughts that veered from self-pity to frustration to despair. Her trial was set for October 2022. It would not take place in Chester, but in Manchester, a larger court, better suited to the scale of the case. The date loomed like a storm cloud. For the parents, it was the day they had waited for, the day they might finally hear answers. For Lucy, it was the day her life would be judged. In those years of waiting, the public fascination only deepened. The story of Lucy Letby occupied a strange place in the national imagination. She was not the obvious image of a killer. She was not notorious like Myra Hindley or Rose West, not hardened or sinister in appearance. She looked ordinary, unthreatening. That was what made the accusations so chilling. How could someone who looked like everyone else, someone's daughter, someone's friend, be capable of such things? That was the question hanging over Britain as the trial approached. A question that would take 10 months of testimony, evidence, and heartbreak to answer. On October 10, 2022, Courtroom 7 of Manchester Crown Court filled with an unusual tension. After years of whispers, investigations, and speculation, the case of the Crown versus Lucy Letby was about to begin. The building itself was hardly dramatic. Manchester Crown Court, a hulking slab of brutalist concrete, sat brooding over the city, more functional than grand, more fortress than stage. Inside, though, anticipation buzzed like static. Families, reporters, lawyers, police officers, all moved through security arches and narrow hallways until they reached the courtroom where Britain's most anticipated trial in decades was about to unfold. At the center of it all sat Lucy Letby. She was not in a nurse's uniform now, but in the dock, wearing plain clothing that could have belonged to any office worker. Her hair was neatly straightened, her expression calm. To many in the public gallery, she seemed almost underwhelming. This was the woman accused of murdering 7 babies and attempting to kill 10 more? She looked ordinary. She looked forgettable. But perhaps that was part of the horror. The courtroom itself was plain. Magnolia walls, beige carpet, rows of wooden benches. It lacked the grandeur of old assizes courts, but it carried a different kind of weight. The weight of evidence, testimony, and human grief. The jury was sworn in. 12 men and women who would spend the next 10 months listening to evidence so harrowing it would haunt them for life. Then the prosecution began. Nick Johnson, KC, leading for the Crown, rose and laid out the case. His voice was steady, his words clinical, but the content was devastating. "You will hear," he told the jury, "that Lucy Letby perverted her role as a caring nurse and used it to kill the very babies she was meant to protect." He described collapses that defied explanation, clusters of deaths far above normal, and a pattern that always seemed to circle back to the same nurse. He spoke of methods the jury would come to know intimately. The injection of air into veins and stomachs, the overfeeding of fragile infants, the deliberate tampering with breathing tubes. And then came the notes. On the courtroom screens appeared the scrawled handwriting police had found in her home. "I am evil, I did this. I killed them on purpose because I'm not good enough. I don't deserve to live." For the parents in court, seeing those words was unbearable. Some wept openly. Others gripped hands tightly, staring at the woman in the dock who, until then, had been only a name in charge sheets. Now she was flesh and blood, sitting a few feet away. The defense, led by Ben Myers, KC, countered with quiet determination. He told the jury there was no forensic evidence tying Letby to the deaths. No CCTV, no fingerprints, no caught-in-the-act moment. He argued she was a scapegoat for systemic failures at a struggling hospital. The consultants, desperate for answers, had latched onto her unfairly. "It is the easy option," he said, "to blame a nurse." For weeks, the prosecution built its case baby by baby, incident by incident. Medical records were displayed on screens, charts and graphs explained by experts. Each tiny life was given a letter, baby A, baby B, baby C, to preserve anonymity. Each story was told in agonizing detail. The hopes of parents, the sudden collapses, the desperate resuscitations, the devastating deaths. Parents took the stand. They described holding their children for the last time, being told their babies had been stable only hours earlier. Some recounted how Lucy herself had comforted them, taken photos, written sympathy cards. For them, reliving those moments in court was almost unbearable. Doctors testified, too. Consultants described their growing unease, their frustration with hospital management, their sense of helplessness as deaths mounted. They spoke of the relief and horror when the deaths stopped after Letby was removed from the ward. The trial stretched on through autumn, into winter, through spring. The jury trudged through snow and rain to hear more evidence. Journalists filled the public gallery, filing dispatches that would dominate headlines. Outside, camera crews waited daily for glimpses of grieving families, or the accused nurse being led into court. Through it all, Lucy Letby remained calm, almost detached. She sat in the dock, writing notes, passing papers to her lawyers. She rarely showed emotion. Only occasionally, when her own barrister spoke of her devotion to nursing, did she cry. To some, her composure looked like coldness. To others, it looked like the shell of a woman overwhelmed. By spring of 2023, the prosecution case had been laid out in full, months of testimony, hundreds of exhibits, expert analyses, and always the damning pattern of deaths when Letby was present. The question hanging over the court was simple but colossal. Was this woman a callous serial killer, or a scapegoat caught in the gears of a desperate system? The trial was only halfway through, but already it had become one of the most extraordinary in British history. A slow, methodical unmasking of a woman who had once been invisible, now accused of crimes that seemed impossible to believe. And the most dramatic chapter was yet to come, because soon Lucy Letby herself would take the stand. By May 2023, after months of medical charts, expert testimony, and grieving parents, the trial reached its most crucial phase. Lucy Letby would take the witness stand. For the jury, it was the moment they had been waiting for. For the parents, it was the chance to finally hear from the woman they had once trusted with their children's lives. When Lucy stepped into the witness box, the courtroom was silent. She looked composed, though her voice trembled slightly at first. The woman who had been a blank figure in the dock for months now had to explain herself, answer the accusations one by one, and face the damning evidence of her own words. Her barrister, Ben Myers, KC, began gently. He guided her through her background. Her childhood in Hereford, her dream of becoming a nurse, her years of study at Chester University, her pride in finally working on the neonatal ward. Lucy spoke softly, often looking down at her notes, sometimes directly at the jury. She described herself as dedicated, caring, passionate about helping premature and vulnerable babies. She insisted she had never harmed a child. When asked about the accusations, she shook her head. "I only ever wanted to care for them," she said. "I couldn't do something like that. It goes against everything I stand for." But then came the hardest questions. Her own barrister brought up the handwritten notes, the ones police had found in her home. Notes scrawled with phrases like, "I am evil. I did this." Lucy explained them as expressions of despair, not confession. "I was in a very dark place," she told the court. "I blamed myself because I was there when these babies died. I thought maybe if I'd been better, if I'd done something differently, they would have lived. I wasn't saying I killed them. I was saying I felt responsible. I hated myself." She described the investigation as overwhelming, the suspensions humiliating, the media attention unbearable. "I felt like my world had collapsed. I didn't want to live." Under Meyer's questioning, Lucy presented herself as a scapegoat, the unlucky nurse who happened to be present during a tragic cluster of deaths. She suggested that the consultants, unable to explain the anomalies, had fixated on her. But then the prosecution began cross-examination. Nick Johnson KC rose, and the tone shifted sharply. He was calm but relentless. One by one, he confronted her with the baby's cases, with the medical evidence, with her presence at each collapse. "Why?" he asked again and again. "Were you always there?" Lucy often answered softly, "I don't know." Sometimes she wept. Sometimes she sat in silence, struggling to respond. The prosecutor pressed her on specifics. Why had she written in medical notes that a baby's deterioration was sudden, when staff remembered otherwise? Why had she searched parents' names on Facebook after their babies died? Why had she written, "I am evil. I did this," if she didn't mean it? Again and again, her replies circled back to the same refrain. She hadn't done it, she didn't know, she couldn't explain. At times, her composure cracked. She broke down when questioned about certain babies, sobbing in the witness box. She insisted she loved her job, loved the babies she cared for, that she had been devoted to them. But to many listening, her answers felt hollow. She could not explain the repeated coincidences, the bizarre medical findings, the chilling words in her own handwriting. The cross-examination stretched for days, sometimes weeks, as Johnson went methodically through each count of murder and attempted murder. By the end, the jury had spent more than a week watching Lucy Letby defend herself under pressure. Her testimony left the courtroom divided. To some, she seemed broken, a fragile woman wrongly accused. To others, she looked like a skilled manipulator. Calm, evasive, rehearsed, hiding behind tears when cornered. For the parents in court, it was agonizing to watch. Many shook their heads. Some wept as she denied everything. To them, it felt like another wound, another refusal to acknowledge what had been taken from them. When she finally stepped down from the witness box, the trial shifted again. The jury had heard from everyone. Parents, doctors, experts, investigators, and now Lucy herself. All that remained was for them to weigh the evidence, to decide whether this quiet young nurse was guilty of the worst crimes imaginable. The waiting was almost over. The verdict would soon define not just Lucy Letby's fate, but the story of Britain's most notorious nurse. By July 2023, after nearly 10 months of evidence, the trial of Lucy Letby was nearing its end. The courtroom, once filled with medical charts and expert witnesses, now turned to the final act, the closing arguments. Nick Johnson KC, for the prosecution, stood before the jury one last time. His voice was calm, but his words carried devastating weight. "You have seen the pattern," he told them. "Time and again, when babies were stable, they collapsed under circumstances that defy medical explanation. And time and again, the common denominator was Lucy Letby." He reminded them of the methods: air injected into bloodstreams, deliberate overfeeding, tampering with breathing support. He pointed to her handwritten notes, her searches of grieving parents on Facebook, the sudden end of collapses once she was removed from the ward. This was not coincidence, he said firmly. This was not misfortune. This was calculated, cold-blooded harm. Then came the defense. Ben Myers KC urged the jury to resist the emotional pull of the case. He warned them against hindsight bias, against joining what he described as a witch hunt. He emphasized the lack of direct forensic proof. Where is the CCTV? Where is the eyewitness? Where is the definitive evidence that Lucy Letby ever harmed a baby? He suggested the hospital had been under pressure, desperate to explain an unprecedented cluster of tragedies. The consultants, he argued, had unfairly fixated on Lucy. It is far easier, he told the jury, to blame a nurse than to admit systemic failures. The jurors listened in silence. For them, the responsibility was almost unbearable. They were being asked to judge whether this quiet, ordinary-looking woman was Britain's most prolific child killer or the scapegoat of a failing hospital. When the final speeches ended, the judge gave his directions. He reminded the jury of their duty, to decide based only on the evidence, not on emotion or sympathy, not on media headlines, not on speculation. Then, on July 10, 2023, the jury retired to deliberate. Days turned into weeks. Behind closed doors, 12 strangers pored over months of testimony. They read transcripts, examined charts, debated every incident. The strain was immense. Outside the courtroom, families waited in limbo. For the parents, each day was agony, reliving their loss, fearing that justice might slip away. Reporters gathered daily outside Manchester Crown Court, waiting for news. Finally, on August 18, 2023, the jury returned. The courtroom was packed. Parents filled the public gallery, clutching tissues, holding hands. The nation watched through rolling news updates, every phone screen glowing with anticipation. Lucy Letby was brought into the dock. She sat quietly, hands folded, her face pale. The clerk stood and began to read the verdicts. On the charge of murder of baby A, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of baby B, guilty. On the charge of murder of baby C, guilty. The list went on. 7 murders. 6 attempted murders. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Parents wept. Some gasped, others broke down completely. The weight of years of grief and suspicion finally had a name. Lucy Letby, guilty beyond reasonable doubt. In the dock, she showed little emotion. At one point, she lowered her eyes, but she did not break down. She did not plead. She did not explain. When the final verdicts were read, the judge thanked the jury for their service. They had endured one of the longest and most harrowing trials in modern history. The guilty verdicts reverberated far beyond the courtroom. Headlines screamed across the UK and the world, "Lucy Letby guilty of baby murders." She was now officially Britain's most prolific child killer in modern times. For the parents, the verdict brought both relief and heartbreak. Justice had been done, but it could not bring back the children they had lost. Many spoke outside court, their voices trembling, saying no verdict could fill the void in their lives. And for Lucy Letby, the verdict meant the rest of her life would be spent behind bars. But sentencing was still to come, and the judge would have his own final, damning words for the nurse who had betrayed her profession and her patients in the most unimaginable way. The guilty verdicts had been read. The parents had wept, the nation had gasped, and Lucy Letby had been confirmed as Britain's most prolific child killer of modern times. But one last act remained: sentencing. For days, anticipation built. What would the punishment be for a nurse who had murdered 7 babies and attempted to kill 6 more? On August 21, 2023, the courtroom once again filled to capacity. Parents, reporters, and legal teams gathered to hear the final words of justice. But one person was missing. Lucy Letby refused to leave her prison cell. She declined to appear in the dock, declined to stand before the judge, declined to hear the voices of the parents whose lives she had destroyed. Her absence sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Parents who had steeled themselves to confront her were robbed of the chance. Many spoke later of their fury, that she could take their children's lives and still deny them the dignity of facing justice in person. Instead, sentencing proceeded without her. Mr. Justice James Goss, the trial judge, sat solemnly at the bench. His words were measured, deliberate, and devastating. "You acted in a way that was completely contrary to the normal instincts of caring and nurturing," he said, addressing her in absentia. "You are the very antithesis of a nurse." He described her actions as a cruel, calculated, and cynical campaign of child murder involving the smallest and most vulnerable of children. He said she had shown no remorse and no mitigating factors. Then he delivered the sentence, a whole life order. It meant Lucy Letby would never leave prison. She would never be eligible for parole. She would die behind bars. Whole life orders are rare in Britain, reserved for the most serious crimes. Serial killers, terrorists, mass murderers. Now Lucy Letby's name joined that grim register, alongside the likes of Peter Sutcliffe, Ian Brady, and Rosemary West. For the parents, the sentence brought a measure of relief. Their babies had received justice. The woman who had betrayed them would never hurt another child. But the absence of Lucy in the dock left a bitter taste. Many said they had wanted her to look them in the eye, to hear their words, to feel their anger. Outside court, parents gave statements through tears. "Justice has been served," one said, "but it doesn't bring our children back." Another, "She took everything from us. She is a coward for not facing us today." The judge himself noted her absence, calling it a final act of defiance. In the weeks that followed, the government promised to change the law, to compel offenders like Letby to appear in court for sentencing. Her refusal had sparked outrage that reached the highest levels of power. In prison, Lucy Letby's life shrank even further. She was moved to a high-security facility, placed among some of the most notorious inmates in the country. Reports described her as isolated, closely monitored, a figure of infamy. The sentencing closed the trial, but it opened a wider reckoning. Questions swirled around the NHS, the Countess of Chester Hospital, and the managers who had resisted doctors' warnings for so long. Could more babies have been saved if action had been taken earlier? Why did it take a police investigation to expose what consultants had suspected for years? The government announced inquiries. Families demanded accountability. Doctors who had spoken out felt vindicated, but also embittered. For they had known, they had warned, and yet their voices had been silenced until it was too late. For Britain, the case of Lucy Letby was not just about one nurse. It was about trust. Trust in hospitals, trust in institutions, trust in the people to whom we hand our most fragile lives. That trust had been broken in the worst possible way. And for the parents, sentencing was not the end. It was a moment of justice, yes, but the grief was forever. Empty cots, silent nurseries, birthdays that would never come. Their children's names would never leave the headlines. But neither would the pain of knowing they had been taken by the very nurse who was supposed to save them. Lucy Letby would spend the rest of her life behind bars. But for the families, the true life sentence was their own. The trial was over. Lucy Letby was sentenced to spend the rest of her life in prison. The headlines declared her Britain's worst child serial killer. But outside the walls of Manchester Crown Court, the story was far from finished. For the parents, justice had been served. Yet their grief was raw and unending. Many described the guilty verdicts as a bittersweet victory. They had answers, but no verdict, no sentence could bring back their children. And almost immediately, a new question began to echo. Who else should be held accountable? Because this was not just the story of a rogue nurse. It was also the story of a hospital that failed to act, of managers who resisted warnings, of a system that silenced its own doctors while babies continued to die. Consultants at the Countess of Chester had been raising concerns about Lucy Letby as early as June 2015. By July 2016, they were practically begging managers to take action. Yet instead of suspending her, hospital executives told the doctors to apologize to her. Even as the deaths mounted, Letby remained on the ward for months. Now, in the aftermath of her conviction, those decisions came under fierce scrutiny. the government announced an independent inquiry. Its aim, to examine how managers handled the consultant's warnings, why the police were not called sooner, and how such catastrophic failings had been allowed to unfold inside an NHS hospital. Families of the victims pushed for the inquiry to be statutory, meaning witnesses could be compelled to testify under oath. They wanted answers, and they wanted them on the record. Many parents said the deaths of their children might have been prevented if hospital leaders had listened to doctors instead of protecting reputations. In Parliament, MPs demanded accountability. Some called for sweeping reforms in the NHS, giving doctors greater protection when they raised concerns. Others pointed out that this was not the first time whistleblowers had been silenced in the health service. But rarely, if ever, had the consequences been so catastrophic. For the consultants themselves, the aftermath was bittersweet. They had been vindicated, but at a terrible cost. For years, they had lived with the weight of suspicion, fearing they were wrong, fearing they might never be heard. Now they were both heroes and tragic figures. The men and women who had fought to stop a killer, only to be ignored until it was too late. Meanwhile, Lucy Letby's name became infamous worldwide. Newspapers from New York to Sydney ran her photo. Documentaries were commissioned. The quiet young nurse from Hereford was now etched into history alongside Britain's darkest criminals. In Chester, the Countess of Chester Hospital struggled with its reputation. The neonatal unit, once a place of fragile hope, was remembered only for tragedy. Parents of future patients asked themselves hard questions. Could they trust the care their babies would receive? Could they trust the institution at all? Inside prison, Lucy Letby's life settled into bleak routine. Reports described her as isolated, kept under close observation, reviled by fellow inmates. To the public, she was a monster. To her parents, she was still their daughter, and they remained loyal even after the verdicts, even after the sentencing. They attended court throughout, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. For them, too, the story was not over. The Letby case left Britain with wounds that would not easily heal. It forced a nation to confront questions about trust in healthcare, about the responsibilities of managers, about the fragility of whistleblowing in institutions that prize reputation over transparency. For the families, every anniversary, every holiday, every quiet night brought reminders of what they had lost. They had fought not only for justice but for the truth, and the truth was brutal. Their babies had not died of chance, not of weakness, not of fate, but because a nurse, trusted above all, had decided to harm them. Lucy Letby was behind bars, but the aftershocks of her crimes rippled outward, through hospitals, through Parliament, through the very fabric of public trust. And those aftershocks would last for years to come. Lucy Letby's conviction shook Britain, not only because of the scale of her crimes but because of where they took place. Hospitals are meant to be sanctuaries, places of healing, where the most vulnerable are safest. The idea that a nurse could turn that sanctuary into a killing field unsettled the nation at its core. But history shows she was not the first. In Britain, memories stirred of Beverly Alit, the so-called Angel of Death. A pediatric nurse like Letby, Alit had attacked 13 children at a hospital in Lincolnshire in 1991, killing 4. Her methods, too, involved insulin overdoses and tampering with equipment. She was sentenced to 13 life terms and remains locked away in a high-security hospital. Elsewhere, the pattern repeated across decades and continents. In Germany, Niels Hogel, a nurse, admitted to injecting patients with lethal drugs so he could then attempt to resuscitate them, playing God with life and death. Authorities believe he killed more than 80 people, making him one of Europe's most prolific killers. In the United States, there was Charles Cullen, a nurse who confessed to killing as many as 40 patients across several hospitals in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. His weapon was often digoxin, the same heart medication Lucy Letby was accused of misusing in some attacks. Investigators suspect his true tally may exceed 400 victims. These cases, spread across time and geography, reveal chilling commonalities. First, the killers exploit the trust inherent in healthcare. A nurse is someone we hand our loved ones to in their most fragile moments. That trust creates both access and cover. When babies or patients die in hospital, grief often overshadows suspicion. Death is tragic, but in a hospital it is also expected. Second, there is the pattern blindness of institutions. When deaths spike, explanations lean toward natural causes, system errors, or bad luck before they consider the unthinkable, that a caregiver is the threat. This denial can last months, even years, allowing killers to continue. Third, these individuals often present as ordinary, not monsters in appearance, but bland, diligent, sometimes even praised as caring. Letby's quiet demeanor, her sympathy cards to grieving parents, mirrored Alit's gentle image and Cullen's reputation as a reliable worker. It is the ordinariness that disarms suspicion until it is too late. And yet, while these cases share patterns, each raises unique psychological questions. Why would someone like Lucy Letby, by all accounts a diligent student, a loved daughter, a loyal friend, choose to harm? Experts speculated. Some suggested a craving for control, a way to assert dominance in a high-pressure environment. Others believed it was about attention, being present during crises, praised for her quick response, woven into the most dramatic moments of life and death. Some pointed to deeper psychological disturbances, perhaps undiagnosed, that warped her sense of identity. But in truth, the motives remain elusive. Letby herself never confessed, never offered a coherent explanation. Like many medical killers before her, she left only devastation and unanswered questions. For society, that uncertainty is part of the horror. Because if someone who looked so normal could do this, how can we ever truly know? Hospitals worldwide reviewed their safeguards in the wake of the Letby case. Questions were asked. How can data be better monitored? How can whistleblowers be better protected? How can institutions balance trust in staff with vigilance against the unimaginable? Lucy Letby's name now stands in the same breath as Alit, Cullen, and Hogel, a reminder that even in the places meant to protect life, danger can lurk unseen, and that is perhaps the deepest betrayal. Not just the killing of innocence, but the shattering of faith in the very people meant to save them. When the cameras outside Manchester Crown Court turned to the parents, the world finally heard the voices of those who had lived this nightmare from the very beginning. For months, their names were shielded, their babies known only as Baby A or Baby B. But behind those anonymized letters were families who had experienced both the miracle of birth and the devastation of loss in the same breath. One mother spoke through tears. "We trusted her. We trusted the hospital. We trusted everyone who walked through those doors. And she took that trust and destroyed it. Our baby was perfect. There was no reason they should have died." Another father, his voice trembling with anger, said, "She smiled at us. She comforted us. And all the while she knew what she had done. That is what haunts me most. The thought that she watched us suffer and said nothing." Impact statements filled the sentencing hearing, read aloud in a courtroom heavy with grief. Parents described birthdays that would never come, toys left untouched, empty cribs and quiet nurseries. One mother said she still woke at night, expecting to hear her baby's cry, only to remember the silence. Many spoke of guilt, even though they knew they had done nothing wrong. "I replay those nights over and over," one parent confessed. "What if I had stayed longer? What if I had noticed something? What if I had said no when she came to take my baby?" That was the cruelty of Lucy Letby's crimes. She not only killed children, she left parents with a lifetime of what-ifs. Some parents described moments that, in hindsight, seemed chilling. The sympathy cards Lucy had written, the small talk in the corridors, the photographs she had taken of babies in incubators, images meant to be mementos, now forever tainted. One family recalled how Lucy had suggested taking pictures of their baby after death, as if preserving a keepsake. At the time, they thought it was kindness. Later, they saw it as a grotesque mask. Despite their pain, many parents spoke with extraordinary courage. They wanted the world to know their babies were more than letters in a legal case. They spoke their names, described their personalities. Tiny smiles, gentle grips, fleeting moments of life that would never fade from memory. The impact of the crimes rippled outward. Grandparents, siblings, aunts, uncles. Entire families were scarred. One mother said her surviving children would grow up never knowing their brother. Another said she could never look at hospitals the same way again. Some parents found solace in solidarity. They met one another during the trial, bonded by shared grief no one else could fully understand. They became a kind of family themselves, united not by choice but by tragedy. And yet, even as they demanded justice, many admitted they might never find peace. "There is no closure," one father said. "There never will be. Our baby is gone. That hole will always be there." The judge's sentence gave them justice. The inquiries promised answers. But the nights remained long, the absence permanent. For these parents, the true life sentence was their own, living each day without the children they had once cradled in hope. Lucy Letby would never see the outside of a prison again. But the parents would forever see the empty space where their babies should have been. If Lucy Letby's crimes revealed the darkest side of one nurse, they also exposed something else: the perilous struggle of doctors who tried to raise the alarm and were ignored. On the neonatal unit at the Countess of Chester Hospital, the consultants were not just senior doctors. They were guardians of the most fragile lives. And by mid-2015, they were deeply uneasy. The deaths didn't add up. Premature babies, yes, but many had been stable, then suddenly collapsed under circumstances that defied medical explanation. In one case, a baby's deterioration was so rapid it stunned even the most experienced consultant. In another, unusual gas patterns were discovered in X-rays, suggesting something unnatural had occurred. Dr. Stephen Breyer, the lead consultant, was among the first to see the pattern. He raised concerns after a cluster of deaths in June 2015. By the following year, he and colleagues like Dr. Ravi Jairam were convinced something sinister was happening, and one name kept appearing at the center of it all: Lucy Letby. They tried to act. Meetings were held with hospital management. Detailed reports were submitted. Concerns were documented again and again. But instead of support, the consultants met resistance. Hospital executives, wary of reputational damage, pushed back. They questioned whether the doctors were being unfair. They asked whether their suspicions were based on evidence or emotion. At one meeting in 2016, when the consultants pressed for Letby to be removed from the ward, managers ordered them to apologize to her instead. The doctors, furious and demoralized, were forced to sit in a room and say sorry to the nurse they believed was harming babies. For months afterward, Lucy remained on the ward, and babies continued to die. The consultants' frustration deepened into despair. They spoke later of sleepless nights, of the torment of watching yet more unexplained collapses while their warnings went unheard. Some even considered resigning, but they stayed because leaving would mean abandoning the fight for their patients. Finally, in mid-2016, Lucy Letby was moved off the neonatal unit. The deaths stopped. For the consultants, the truth was obvious. Yet still, hospital leaders resisted calling the police. It would take nearly a year before Cheshire Constabulary was brought in, a year in which Letby lived freely, socialized, and even pursued further training. When the trial finally vindicated the doctors, the sense of relief was mixed with bitterness. They had been right. Their instincts had been correct. But why had it taken so long for anyone to listen? Dr. Jairam later told the media that he had nightmares for years about the babies who might have been saved if action had been taken sooner. "We were trying to raise the alarm," he said, "but the system didn't want to hear it." Their story is not just about medical vigilance. It is about the cost of speaking up in a culture that prizes reputation over truth. The consultants faced stonewalling, bureaucratic delay, and subtle intimidation. The quiet, crushing pressure of being told not to rock the boat. In the end, they were vindicated. Their persistence had brought Letby to justice. But their warnings, ignored for months, will forever haunt the legacy of the hospital. The Letby case has since become a rallying cry for whistleblowers across the NHS. Doctors, nurses, and staff now point to Chester as a symbol of what happens when management silences concerns. Reforms are being debated, protections promised. But for the consultants who lived it, no policy change can undo the years of anguish. They saved lives by refusing to stay silent, but they carry the grief of those they could not save. By the time Lucy Letby was convicted, the public was no longer asking only, "How could she do this?" They were also asking, how was she allowed to? At the Countess of Chester Hospital, executives and senior managers faced growing scrutiny. The consultants had spoken. They had raised concerns as early as 2015. They had pleaded for action. And yet, Letby remained on the ward for months, even years, while babies continued to die. The problem was not lack of warning. It was lack of will. Hospital managers were deeply wary of the implications of accusing a nurse. Suspending her could trigger scandal. Involving the police could destroy public trust. And so, instead of acting decisively, they delayed. They doubted. They minimized. When consultants pressed their case, managers asked whether their suspicions were personal. They questioned whether the doctors were bullying Lucy. At one point, they even demanded the consultants apologize to her. A stunning reversal that left the whistleblowers humiliated and furious. Behind this was a culture all too familiar in healthcare. Protect the reputation of the institution above all else. To acknowledge the possibility of a murderer in the neonatal unit would be catastrophic. Better, they seemed to believe, to keep suspicions quiet and hope the deaths stopped on their own. But the deaths did not stop. It was not until mid-2016 that Letby was finally removed from frontline duty. Even then, she was reassigned to clerical work, not suspended. Parents who later learned this detail were horrified. She had been shielded, not sidelined. And the police were not called until May 2017, nearly 2 years after the first warnings. In that time, multiple babies had been harmed. Families now ask, with devastating simplicity, if they had acted sooner, would our child still be alive? The hospital has since been engulfed in criticism. Public inquiries are underway. Former executives are being asked to explain themselves. Why did they ignore their own doctors? Why did they resist external investigation? Why did protecting reputation seem to matter more than protecting babies? The answers are uncomfortable. Some insiders describe a culture of denial, where managers prioritized avoiding bad press over confronting reality. Others point to structural flaws in the NHS. Bureaucracy that moves slowly, leadership more attuned to targets and funding than patient safety. At the heart of it is a chilling paradox. The very system designed to safeguard patients created an environment where danger could thrive. Not because nobody noticed, but because those who did were silenced. For the families, this is as much a betrayal as Letby's crimes. It was not just one nurse. It was an entire chain of authority that looked away, that chose delay over action, that let harm continue when it could have been stopped. As inquiries proceed, some parents demand criminal accountability for hospital leaders. Others call for reforms to ensure doctors' warnings cannot be dismissed so easily in the future. The case is already shaping debates about mandatory reporting, whistleblower protections, and the balance between institutional reputation and patient safety. In Chester, the hospital carries scars that may never heal. For the staff who worked there, many of whom dedicated their lives to saving fragile babies, the shadow of Lucy Letby and the failures of management will forever haunt their legacy. And for Britain, the Countess of Chester is now a symbol of systemic failure. Proof that danger does not thrive in darkness alone. Sometimes it thrives in the light, when those in power refuse to see. When Lucy Letby was convicted in August 2023, Britain's collective grief quickly turned into outrage. The crimes themselves were almost too terrible to comprehend, a nurse murdering babies. But what ignited fury across the country was the realization that warnings had been ignored. Consultants had pleaded. Families had trusted. Yet managers had stalled while children died. For ordinary people, the betrayal cut deep. The NHS was not just a healthcare system. It was a cornerstone of national identity. To learn that a hospital had harbored a serial killer and failed to stop her sooner was a shock to the national conscience. The media reflected the mood. Headlines screamed, "Why wasn't she stopped?" Hospital ignored doctors' warnings. Talk shows filled with anguished parents and furious commentators. Lucy Letby's name became shorthand for the worst kind of institutional betrayal. Politicians could not ignore the uproar. Within days of sentencing, the government announced an independent inquiry into how the Countess of Chester Hospital had handled the case. Initially non-statutory, the inquiry was later upgraded, allowing witnesses to be compelled to give evidence under oath. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak called the crimes shocking and harrowing, pledging that lessons would be learned. Health Secretary Steve Barclay promised reforms to ensure doctors' warnings could never again be brushed aside. One particular flashpoint was Letby's refusal to appear in court for sentencing. Parents, denied the chance to confront her, called it a final act of cowardice. Their anger resonated nationwide. Soon after, ministers vowed to pass new laws forcing offenders to attend their sentencing hearings, a reform born directly from the outrage of the Letby case. The wider public debate also sharpened around whistleblowing in the NHS. If senior consultants had been ignored in Chester, how many others across the country might have been silenced? How many other tragedies might have been prevented if whistleblowers had been heard? Campaigners demanded stronger protections for staff who raised concerns. Unions called for cultural change, an end to what some described as a defensive bureaucracy that prioritized image over safety. And beyond politics, there was the raw emotional response of ordinary people. Candlelit vigils were held. Families who had never met the victims left flowers at hospital gates. Social media filled with messages of grief and solidarity. We will never forget those little lives. For many, the Letby case became more than just a crime story. It was a mirror held up to the nation's most trusted institution. Could people still walk into hospitals with confidence? Could parents hand over their newborns without fear? The government's promises of reform were only the beginning. Trust, once broken, would take years to rebuild. And yet, amid the outrage, there was also resilience. Parents of the victims, though shattered by grief, became voices for change. Some vowed to fight for reforms so that no other family would endure what they had suffered. Their courage inspired others, turning private agony into public advocacy. Lucy Letby was behind bars, but her crimes had reshaped Britain, not just in law and policy, but in the way the nation thought about trust, vulnerability, and the responsibility of those who hold power. For all the evidence, all the investigations, all the headlines, one question remains unanswered. Why? Why would a young woman, trained to save lives, turn instead to killing? What drove Lucy Letby, a nurse with no history of violence, no obvious signs of cruelty, to target the smallest, most vulnerable patients? Throughout the trial, prosecutors made one thing clear. There was no single, neat explanation. Letby never confessed. She never gave interviews revealing her thoughts. She never attempted to justify herself. Even in court, when asked to account for collapses and deaths, she denied wrongdoing to the very end. And yet, investigators and experts pieced together fragments of possibility. Some pointed to control. Neonatal intensive care is an environment where outcomes are uncertain, where doctors and nurses often feel helpless in the face of fragile life. By secretly causing crises, Letby placed herself at the center of drama, the one who decided who lived and who died. Others suggested a craving for attention. Colleagues noticed that Letby often appeared at babies' bedsides during emergencies, sometimes even taking the lead in resuscitation efforts. To be present in those high-stakes moments was to be noticed, praised, needed. In this theory, the harm was a pathway to recognition. Psychologists also considered deeper motives. Some speculated about a form of Munchausen by proxy, a condition in which caregivers cause harm to those in their care to gain sympathy or attention. Though more commonly associated with parents harming their own children, the underlying dynamic, creating illness to then appear as the rescuer, bore resemblance to Letby's pattern. There were also darker possibilities. Sadism, the taking of pleasure in suffering. Some experts noted the cruelty of certain acts, injecting air into babies' veins, poisoning them with insulin, as evidence of calculated malice. The fact that she sometimes struck twice against the same set of twins suggested persistence, even obsession. And then there were the personal clues. Handwritten notes found in her home became infamous. On one, she had scribbled, "I am evil. I did this." On another, she declared she was a horrible, evil person. Some read like confessions, others like the ramblings of someone consumed by guilt, confusion, or self-loathing. prosecutors argued these notes revealed the truth. A fractured mind, aware of the horror yet unable or unwilling to stop. Defense lawyers, however, said they showed only the mental collapse of a woman wrongly accused. Friends and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the Lucy they knew with the Lucy on trial. They described her as quiet, kind, even geeky. She liked shopping trips, holidays abroad, social nights with colleagues. Nothing about her screamed danger. And perhaps that was part of the terror, the ordinariness. Because what unsettles most about Lucy Letby is that she does not fit the caricature of a killer. No violent past, no history of abuse.
No sinister demeanor.
Just a seemingly normal young woman, smiling in photographs, trusted by parents, adored by friends. And yet, beneath that facade, a deadly truth lurked. The reality may be that we will never fully understand her motives. Some killers leave confessions, diaries, or interviews that offer glimpses into their psychology. Lucy Letby has given nothing. Her silence leaves only speculation, theories stitched together from behavior, notes, and patterns of crime. But perhaps that is the final horror. The why may remain forever locked inside her. The parents, the doctors, the public may never hear a reason that makes sense, because there may never have been one. In the end, the most chilling thing about Lucy Letby is not only what she did, but that she did it without explanation. That ordinariness can mask monstrosity. That the face of evil can look like anyone at all. From the moment Lucy Letby's name entered the headlines, the story became a media sensation. In Britain, every major newspaper carried daily updates from the trial. Television news led with her photograph, the soft-featured young woman with glasses, smiling in holiday snapshots, standing beside friends at parties. The juxtaposition was jarring. How could this face belong to a murderer of babies? The Daily Mail, the Times, the Guardian, and countless others filled their front pages with the case. Tabloids poured over details from court. The insulin overdoses, the air embolisms, the chilling notes found in Letby's home. Broadsheets analyzed systemic failings at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Each angle fed a national appetite to understand. But the story didn't stop at Britain's borders. CNN, the New York Times, Le Monde, Der Spiegel, and broadcasters from Tokyo to Sydney covered the trial. Lucy Letby became an international name, part of a grim list of killer nurses whose crimes defied comprehension. Documentary crews quickly moved in. Channel 4, ITV, and the BBC commissioned in-depth specials. Netflix and other global platforms reportedly explored series rights. The appetite for true crime was insatiable, and Letby's case had all the elements that gripped audiences. Betrayal of trust, institutional failure, psychological mystery. And yet, this raised uncomfortable questions. For the parents, media coverage was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it gave their babies' stories visibility. It ensured the failures at Chester would not be swept under the rug. On the other, it meant their grief became public property. Every detail of their tragedy was dissected for strangers, debated on talk shows, speculated on social media. Some criticized the media for sensationalism. Photographs of tiny hospital cots and stock footage of syringes played alongside dramatic music. Headlines described Letby as Britain's worst child serial killer. True, but also a label that risked reducing the story to shock value rather than human loss. Others pointed out that the coverage often focused more on Letby herself than on the victims. Her school years, her friendships, her lifestyle, her quiet suburban upbringing, all became subject to scrutiny. Meanwhile, the babies were often referred to only as Baby A, Baby B, their identities anonymized by law. This imbalance raised an ethical dilemma. In telling the story of Lucy Letby, were the media inadvertently amplifying her name while the true lives lost remained faceless? At the same time, public hunger for answers fueled debate shows, podcasts, and online forums. Was she mentally ill? Was the hospital complicit? What reforms were needed? In coffee shops, offices, and homes, people argued about motives and management, drawn into the case as if it were a national drama. The Letby case revealed not only the horror of her crimes, but the modern machinery of true crime storytelling. In an age where tragedy becomes content, The line between awareness and exploitation is dangerously thin. And yet, awareness matters. Without public outrage, there might not have been an inquiry. Without constant headlines, the failures of hospital management might never have been exposed. Without the parents' voices amplified by the media, reform might have stalled. The question remains, how do we honor the truth without turning it into spectacle? How do we tell these stories in ways that remember the victims, not just the villain? Lucy Letby's case forced not only hospitals and politicians to reckon with hard truths, but also the media and the audiences who consume it. When the guilty verdicts were announced, it wasn't only families who felt the shock. Across Britain's hospitals, healthcare workers paused, read the headlines, and felt a chill. Lucy Letby had been one of them, a nurse, a professional sworn to care for the most vulnerable. Her crimes forced every doctor, every nurse, every student in training to ask, what does this mean for us? For the trust people place in us? For nurses especially, the impact was profound. Nursing is built on compassion, intimacy, trust. Patients allow nurses into the most private, vulnerable moments of their lives. Parents hand over their newborns, believing they are safe. The bond is sacred. Now, one of their own had shattered it. On neonatal wards around the country, some nurses reported parents looking at them differently, with questions in their eyes, with hesitation in their voices, not overt mistrust, but uncertainty. And in a profession where trust is everything, even a flicker of doubt was devastating. Doctors, too, felt the aftershocks. They saw in the Chester consultants a reflection of their own fears. What if they noticed something unusual and weren't believed? What if bureaucracy silenced them too? The case became a symbol of vulnerability not just for babies, but for the professionals trying to protect them. Professional bodies scrambled to respond. The Royal College of Nursing, the British Medical Association, all issued statements affirming that Letby's crimes were an aberration, not a reflection of nursing or medicine as a whole. They reminded the public that the NHS was full of dedicated staff who saved lives every day. But inside the profession, conversations turned more personal. Nurses asked one another, could I have spotted it? Would I have spoken up? Would I have been believed? The Letby case became a touchstone in staff rooms and training sessions, a story passed to new generations as both a warning and a lesson. On the neonatal wards themselves, staff carried a new weight. Parents were more anxious. Questions were sharper. Consent felt different. Nurses found themselves explaining procedures with extra detail, reassuring with extra care, aware that trust had to be rebuilt one family at a time. And yet, amid the anxiety, there was also solidarity. Healthcare workers stood together, determined not to let one nurse define their profession. They reminded themselves and the world that compassion still outweighed cruelty, that every day thousands of babies were nurtured, not harmed. For some, though, the case left scars. Staff at the Countess of Chester, who had worked alongside Letby, spoke of trauma. They wondered how they had missed it. They questioned their own judgment. Some needed counseling. Others left the profession entirely, unable to reconcile their calling with the horror that had unfolded under their watch. In the end, the impact of Lucy Letby on healthcare workers was twofold: a shadow of mistrust that had to be overcome, and a rallying cry for change. The profession emerged bruised, but also more determined than ever to protect, to safeguard, to ensure that such a betrayal could never happen again. Because for doctors and nurses, the greatest tragedy of all would be if one killer destroyed the bond of trust that millions of patients still need. Lucy Letby will never walk free again, but her presence will linger, not just in prison, but in the laws, reforms, and memories her crimes have forced Britain to confront. Already, the case has spurred change. The government has vowed to strengthen whistleblower protections, ensuring that doctors who raise alarms cannot be silenced by bureaucrats or reputational fears. The Countess of Chester Hospital, once just another regional trust, is now a name etched into history as a symbol of what happens when warnings are ignored. The independent inquiry into the case has been given full statutory powers, allowing investigators to compel witnesses to testify under oath. This marks a turning point in how Britain examines healthcare failures, no longer relying on voluntary cooperation, but demanding accountability. New laws are also being shaped directly by the Letby trial. When she refused to appear for sentencing, families described it as one last act of cruelty. Their voices carried into Parliament. Soon after, ministers announced legislation that would require convicted criminals to face their victims in court, a reform born from the agony of parents denied even that final moment of confrontation. In medical training, Letby's crimes have become a case study. Lectures on patient safety and hospital culture now cite her trial as a warning of the need for vigilance, of the danger of silencing whistleblowers, of the devastating consequences of misplaced trust. New generations of doctors and nurses will learn her name not as a colleague, but as a caution. For families, the legacy is deeply personal. Some parents have become advocates, determined to transform their grief into change. They fight for reforms so that no other mother or father has to wonder whether their child was safe in hospital. They campaign for stronger oversight, better communication, and systems that put patients before reputation. The Letby case will also shape public memory of the NHS itself. For decades, the service has been a point of pride, a symbol of compassion and care. Now, alongside its triumphs, it carries a shadow, the reminder that even within its walls, evil found space to act. Rebuilding that trust will take time, transparency, and a willingness to face uncomfortable truths. And then there is the cultural memory. Just as the names Beverly Alit or Harold Shipman linger in Britain's collective consciousness, so too will Lucy Letby's. Not because the public wishes to remember her, but because forgetting is impossible. Her crimes were too cruel, her victims too innocent. Yet within that memory lies a choice: to remember her only as a killer, or to remember also the babies whose lives, though short, changed a nation. Parents continue to speak their children's names, refusing to let them be reduced to court codes or statistics. Their voices ensure that the legacy of this case is not just about one nurse's darkness, but about lives loved and lost. Decades from now, historians will look back on the Letby trial as a turning point. A moment when Britain was forced to re-examine its hospitals, its systems, its protections. A case that proved the unthinkable can happen even in the places we trust most. Lucy Letby's legacy, then, is twofold. It is the horror of betrayal, and the hope that from it, change will emerge. Lucy Letby's trial was not just a courtroom drama, or even just a medical scandal. It became something bigger, a cultural reckoning. At its heart, the case forced society to confront one of its most fragile bonds, the trust we place in caregivers. Parents handed their newborns to a nurse in scrubs, believing she would protect them. Instead, she betrayed them in the worst possible way. That betrayal rippled outward, leaving many to ask, if we cannot trust those sworn to heal, who can we trust? The shock went deeper because of who the victims were. Babies, lives that had barely begun. Their innocence amplified the cruelty, and their deaths struck at something primal, the instinct to protect children. In cultures everywhere, harming a child is seen as the ultimate crime. To learn that such harm had come from a nurse, someone seen as an angel of mercy, shook the very foundations of collective belief. The Letby case also became a mirror for broader conversations about evil in ordinary life. Here was no monster in the shadows, no obvious villain. Lucy Letby looked like anyone you might see on a bus, in a cafe, on a hospital ward. That normality was what unsettled people most. Evil did not wear a mask. It wore a smile. Philosophers and commentators invoked the concept of the banality of evil. The idea that great harm can be done not by obvious monsters, but by ordinary people who choose cruelty in everyday settings. Letby's case seemed to embody that idea, adding her name to the list of killers who appeared unremarkable, even gentle, until the truth emerged. The cultural impact also extended to parenting itself. Many new parents admitted they looked at hospitals differently. Trust was still there, but thinner, more fragile. Some said they now asked more questions, checked more details, lingered at their baby's bedside longer than before. The shadow of Chester stretched into maternity wards nationwide. Beyond healthcare, the story sparked reflection on systems of power and silence. People saw in the consultant's struggle a pattern familiar in workplaces everywhere. Warnings ignored, voices silenced, reputations protected at the expense of truth. The case became not only about medicine, but about the cost of speaking up in any institution where image outweighs honesty. It also shaped cultural memory of crime itself. The names of Harold Shipman, Beverly Alit, and now Lucy Letby stand as reminders that trust can be weaponized. Their cases linger not only in legal history, but in the collective psyche, cautionary tales told and retold to remind us of vulnerability and vigilance. And yet, amid the darkness, the cultural response carried something else too: resilience. Parents spoke their babies' names publicly, ensuring they were remembered not as case numbers, but as lives loved. Communities rallied around the families, refusing to let grief be borne alone. In that shared mourning, there was solidarity, even hope. Lucy Letby showed society how fragile innocence is, but the families showed how strong love can be, even in the face of unimaginable loss. That, too, is part of the cultural legacy. Years from now, when the details of trials fade, the memory will remain. A case that forced Britain and the world to ask difficult questions about trust, evil, and the price of silence. In the end, Lucy Letby's story is not really about her. It is about the babies whose lives were cut short, the families who carry grief that words can never capture, the doctors who fought to be heard, the nurses and staff left to rebuild trust, and a nation forced to confront truths it wished were impossible. The courtroom provided answers, guilty verdicts, life sentences, and some measure of justice. But justice does not mend the hole left by a lost child. Parents still return to nurseries left unfinished. They still carry birthdays that will never be celebrated, futures that will never unfold. What remains, then, is memory and legacy. The memory belongs to the families. They speak their children's names aloud, refusing to let them be reduced to anonymous letters on a legal charge sheet. Each baby was unique, cherished, loved. Each had a story that mattered, however brief. And through their parents' voices, those stories continue. The legacy belongs to all of us. For hospitals, it is a mandate to listen to whistleblowers, to act swiftly, to put safety above reputation. For politicians, it is a responsibility to ensure the laws protect the vulnerable and that silence is never allowed to shield danger. For the public, it is a reminder that trust is precious and that vigilance is the price of keeping it. And for healthcare workers, it is both a wound and a vow. A wound because one of their own betrayed the profession. A vow because, in her shadow, they are more determined than ever to live up to the trust parents place in them every day. Lucy Letby will spend the rest of her life behind bars. She will be remembered as Britain's most prolific child serial killer. But the truest way to remember this case is not to dwell on her name, but to remember the babies. The little lives that, though short, reshaped a nation. Their legacy is not only grief, but change. Their memory is not only tragedy, but love. And their story, carried by parents, doctors, and communities, ensures that even in darkness, light can endure. Because the final truth of the Lucy Letby case is this: evil can wound, but it cannot erase love, cannot silence truth forever, and it cannot stop the world from remembering the lives that mattered most.